Some mornings arrive quietly. The sun climbs without ceremony. The world turns at its usual pace, indifferent and unhurried, as if nothing of consequence is about to happen. Monday, August 14th was not that kind of morning, but it pretended to be. That was the cruelest part. At 6:47, the Iron Bell Diner sat on the edge of Route 66 like something the desert had chosen to keep. It was a low, flat building with a rusted tin roof and a hand-painted sign that the California sun had been fading for so many years, the letters barely existed anymore. There were 11 red vinyl stools at the counter, 4 window booths with cracked laminate tabletops, and 6 more booths along the back wall. The floor was black and white checkerboard linoleum, worn to gray in the high traffic lanes. A ceiling fan turned overhead without much conviction. The air conditioning unit above the entrance had been running since May and sounded like something slowly dying from the effort. The Iron Bell had been serving truckers, locals, and the occasional lost tourist since 1971. It smelled of coffee and bacon grease, and something older underneath both of those things, something that belonged to a time when Route 66 was still the spine of the American dream, and not just a road people drove to remind themselves it had existed. The breakfast rush had already thinned. The last of the early truckers had paid their checks. Clifford Allgate, a retired school teacher from Elm Street who came in every weekday and ordered soft-boiled eggs and wheat toast, was on his second cup of tea doing the crossword puzzle he printed from his computer each morning. 3 men occupied stools at the counter with the unhurried patience of people who had nowhere particular to be and had made peace with that. And at the corner booth, the one farthest from the door, tucked into the pocket of shadow, the morning light never quite reached, a man sat alone. He was not a small man. He was not a soft man. He ordered black coffee and dry toast, and he had been doing so on certain mornings for 6 weeks now, though not always on the same day. He arrived without pattern, stayed without explanation, and left without ceremony. The staff had learned not to ask. His name was Walter Briggs, Walt to the people who knew him, Hammer to everyone else. He was 58 years old, though he carried the kind of age that arrives not just from time, but from the specific weight of what that time contained. His hair was the color of iron left in the rain, dark at the roots, silver at the temples, gray through the heavy beard that covered the lower half of his face. The beard was trimmed close on the sides and longer at the center, tied at the bottom with a small rubber band, which was the only soft detail in an otherwise uncompromising appearance. His arms were covered in tattoos, not the clean, deliberate work of a man who had planned each one, but the accumulated record of a life. Names, dates, an anchor. A compass rose with one direction missing. A small cross on the inside of his left wrist that he had received in a makeshift parlor somewhere outside Riyadh in January of 1991, a week before the ground war started, a week before he learned what human beings were capable of doing to each other when someone in a government building decided it was time. He had come back from the Gulf War with his body intact and something else considerably less so. He did not talk about what. Men of his generation mostly didn't. You either understood that some things lived in a man, the way shrapnel lives in a body too deep to remove without causing more damage than leaving it in place, or you didn't understand, and no amount of explanation would change that. On the back of the leather vest he wore over a gray thermal shirt, despite the August heat, was the emblem of the Burdu chapter of the Hells Angels. The death's head wings spread eyes that held nothing and everything at the same time. The vest had been worn to the texture of old wood, the leather so broken in that it moved with him the way a second skin moves. Above the left breast pocket appeared shone a patch in block letters, Hammer. He had earned that name the same way he had earned everything in his life, the hard way and without apology. Walt Briggs always sat with his back to the wall. He had done so since coming home from the desert. It was not a decision, it was what his body did, the same way his eyes automatically mapped the exits in every room he entered, the same way his hands went still, and his breathing slowed whenever the door opened and someone new walked in. 33 years of civilian life had not changed any of it. Some software once installed does not uninstall. He was on his second cup of coffee when Emma Ryder refilled it without being asked. She did that for the people she had learned. She did it because she had a good memory for habits and because a cup poured at the right moment was often the difference between a decent tip and nothing. And every dollar mattered in ways that people who had never truly been without money were not equipped to understand. Walt looked up when she poured. He did not smile. He did not say thank you. He nodded a single slow movement that carried acknowledgement and something close to respect. And Emma registered it the way she registered everything in her section, which was completely and without visible reaction. She moved on. There were tables to check, There was coffee at the counter. There was always something next. Walt watched her cross the floor, not the way some men watch waitresses, the way a man watches someone who reminds him of something he has spent a long time trying not to think about. The age was different. The circumstances were different. But something in the way she moved, the held-back quality of it, the particular economy of a person who had learned that every motion needed to count pulled at something in him he could not name and did not try to. He looked back at his coffee. He had come in today not on a Tuesday, but on a Monday. He had been doing that sometimes lately, coming in on days that were not Tuesdays. He did not examine the reason too closely. He knew what it was. The diner had smelled the same way on the first Tuesday he came in, and the smell had done what smells do when they belong to a time you are not finished with yet. He drank his coffee. He watched the door. Emma Ryder was 24 years old. She looked older. Not because she had been careless with herself, but because she had been asked to carry more than her share for longer than was fair. There was a readiness in her face, a watchfulness that belonged to people who had learned not to be surprised by bad news because bad news had been consistent enough to make surprise a waste of energy. Her hair was blonde in the natural way, darker in summer, lighter toward winter, never the same color twice but always recognizably hers. She kept it pulled back during shifts with the same elastic band she'd been using for 3 weeks because she kept forgetting to buy new ones. And the money she would have spent on hair ties was money that had somewhere more urgent to go. Her uniform was a pale blue dress with white trim at the collar, washed enough times that it had achieved a softness that cost nothing and communicated everything about how long she had been doing this. Her hands were rough, not rough as a style, rough from 6 hours a day in hot water and bleach solution, from carrying plates heavier than they looked over distances longer than they seemed, from the small daily damages of a job that used a human body as a tool and offered in return a minimum wage and the goodwill of strangers. She was a mother. Her son's name was Noah. He was 3 years old with his mother's blonde hair and a gap between his front teeth that his pediatrician said would close in a year or two. He laughed at things that weren't particularly funny and was frightened of dogs that posed no threat and had recently developed a complete and non-negotiable attachment to a stuffed elephant he called Blue, despite the fact that it was clearly gray. He was the one fixed point in Emma Ryder's life. Everything else orbited him. She was 12 days late on rent, $420. That was the number that lived in her chest on that Monday morning, sitting behind the customer service smile present beneath every order she took and every table she cleared. Her landlord, a man named Corbett Tully, who owned the duplex on Marchfield Street, where she and Noah had lived for 2 years, had called Friday afternoon. His voice had been apologetic in the way that voices become when the person speaking is genuinely sorry, but also genuinely means what they are saying. He had given her until Friday. 4 days. She had $83 in her checking account, $61 in Sirsham in an envelope in the kitchen drawers at home, $14 on a prepaid card she used for online bills. And she had this job which over 4 days of good shifts might generate another $140 in tips, $122 short. She had done this math so many times in the past 3 days that it had become a kind of background sound running underneath everything else audible, even when she was filling salt shakers and taking Clifford Allgate's order and carrying plates from the pass-through window to table 3. She had learned to let it run without letting it show. The people who tipped best were the ones who felt comfortable. The people who felt comfortable were served by someone who looked like everything was fine. Everything was fine. Her phone vibrated in her apron pocket at 7:14. She didn't check it. She already knew it was Corbett Tully, and she already knew what he wanted, and there was nothing she could tell him yet. At 7:45, a voice came through the pass-through window, like a man who had been shouting across kitchen noise for 22 years and had permanently calibrated his volume to that environment. Gus Merritt was a large man who had once been considerably larger before his doctor gave him a speech about cholesterol that had apparently landed with unusual force. He wore a white apron that he replaced on a schedule known only to himself, and he had a tattoo of a compass on his right forearm from a period of his life he never discussed, and he hummed country songs under his breath while he cooked. Emma had come to find the humming deeply comforting in the way that predictable background sounds become comforting when everything else in your life is uncertain. He had run the Iron Bell for 22 years. He had bought it from the original owner, a man named Theo Bell, who had opened it in 1971 and who had named it after himself with the specific self-assurance of a man who believes his establishment will outlast him, which it had. Gus had changed almost nothing about it when he took over. He had replaced the refrigerator in 2019 at a cost that had nearly ended his ownership of the place. He had repainted the parking lot lines. Everything else was as Theo Bell had left it. Emma grabbed the plates he called through the window and delivered them. She was refilling coffee at the counter when the door opened. The chime above the door was a small brass bell that Theo Bell had installed in 1971 and that had never been replaced. It made a thin, cheerful sound that had announced 1,000 ordinary mornings and a handful of extraordinary ones. On this particular morning at 8:16, it announced the arrival of something the iron bell was not built to handle. There were 5 of them. They came through the door the way a weather system moves with pressure, with a sense that the space itself would need to adjust, rather than the other way around. They were loud before they were fully inside their voices, belonging to a conversation that had started in the vehicle outside a signal green Porsche 911 that was currently parked diagonally across 2 spaces in the gravel lot, its engine ticking as it cooled in the August heat. The one in front was Bryce Harmon. He was 22 years old and built in the way that comes from a personal trainer and 3 sessions a week in the understanding that the results are not an achievement, but a baseline. He wore a white linen shirt expensive in the way that manages to look both casual and deliberate unbuttoned to the 3rd button, a gold chain at his throat, tan leather loafers on his feet that had not been purchased within 200 miles of Barstow. On his face, designer sunglasses he did not remove when he entered the building. His face behind the sunglasses was handsome in a way that had probably never required much effort and had therefore never taught him anything. The 4 people behind him, 2 men, 2 women, were assembled with the same understanding of money as the medium in which they naturally moved. They laughed at something one of them said, a private joke from the car belonging to a world that had nothing to do with the Iron Bell Diner, but that they brought in with them like a second atmosphere. Bryce stopped 2 steps inside the door and looked around. It was not the look of someone taking in a new place with curiosity. It was an assessment. The quick dismissive scan of a man who has decided in advance that nothing here merits his full attention and is simply confirming the conclusion. God, he said, he did not lower his voice. It smells like grease and 40 years of not trying in here. The taller woman, dark-haired in a dress inappropriate for a Route 66 diner in any season, made a sound that was half laugh and half performance. Bryce, are you actually sure about this place? Yelp called it authentic. He pulled the sunglasses down half an inch and looked at the interior over the top of them. Authentic means they haven't updated anything since Nixon. The 3 men at the counter stools had gone quiet in the way people go quiet when something enters a room they have decided not to engage with. Clifford Allgate looked at his crossword puzzle and became very interested in 14 across. Gus appeared briefly in the pass-through window, read the situation in approximately 2 seconds, and disappeared back into the kitchen. In the corner booth, Walt Briggs did not move. He kept watching the door. He watched Bryce Harmon the way a man watches something he has encountered before in different packaging, recognizing not the specific face but the posture behind it, the unmistakable weight of someone who has never been asked to consider the cost of walking into a room and making it smaller. Emma came around the counter with her customer service smile in place, the real one she kept for people who had earned it. This was the other kind. Hi there, welcome to the Iron Bell. If you give me just a moment, I can clear a booth for you, or booth 6 is ready right now. Bryce had already walked past her. He stopped at the center booth, the largest one, the one that had just been vacated by a family of 4, covered in the remnants of their meal syrup. Glazed plates crumpled, napkins, a sippy cup on its side, a child's drawing on the paper placemat that had been left behind. He pointed at the table. The gesture used for furniture you want moved. Clean it, he said. We want this one. Emma stopped for exactly 1 beat, the smallest pause invisible unless you were looking for it. Behind it, a number $420. 4 days. Of course, she said. Just 1 moment to grab the bus tub. We don't have a moment. He still hadn't looked at her directly. He was looking at the mess as if the mess were a personal failing she had arranged specifically for him. My car is in the sun. I've been driving since 6. I want to sit down. He turned toward her then. He looked through her, the way light looks through glass, registering the surface just enough to pass through it without stopping, without weight. Do you have almond milk? He said. We have regular milk, sir, and whole. Never mind. He turned back to his group with the expression of a man whose suspicions have been confirmed. I didn't think so. Then over his shoulder, not looking, cleaned the table. Not a single crumb. Emma nodded. She got the bus tub. She began clearing. Her hands were steady. She had trained them to be. She moved the plates, stacked the napkins, retrieved the sippy cup, and paused just for a moment over the paper placemat with the child's drawing. A house, a sun, a figure with 5 fingers on each hand. She set it aside carefully before wiping down the table. She could not have said why. Some reflex in her, the part that was a mother before anything else, could not throw away something a child had made without acknowledging that it existed. Bryce and his group stood watching her work. They watched the way people watch service happen, with the non-observation of those who see without registering, the way they watch an ATM produce cash without thinking about the mechanics. "Look at her hands," Bryce said. He was not whispering. He was speaking in the way people speak when they believe the person being described either cannot hear or does not merit the consideration of privacy. He said it to the woman beside him, but he said it loud enough for the room. "You see that?" The woman made a small sound. "Rough as the counter," Bryce said. Emma did not stop wiping. The heat rose in her face, not anger. Not yet, but the specific burning of humiliation, which is its own compound, which starts in the chest and moves upward and has nowhere to go, and so stays where it is, pressurized and silent and tasting of something held back. $420. She finished. She laid out the laminated menus. She asked in a voice that gave nothing away whether she could start them with some water. "Sparkling," Bryce said, sliding into the booth. "San Pellegrino. With lime, please." "We have tap water, sir, or soda." A long theatrical exhale. The sound of a man for whom the world's failure to meet his requirements had become a form of personal persecution. "5 Cokes, diet for the ladies." He paused. "And make sure the ice is clean." Emma went to the counter. Her back was to the booth. For 3 seconds, just 3, she let herself stop performing. She stood at the soda machine and she breathed and she felt the burning in her chest and she did not call it what it was and she put it nowhere. And then she filled 5 glasses with ice and Coca-Cola and she turned around. At the pass-through window, Gus was watching Bryce's table with the expression of a man weighing how much concern he could show without making things worse. "You know who that is," he said quietly. Emma looked at the booth, at the white linen shirt, the gold chain, the quality of ownership with which the young man occupied the largest booth in the room. "No. I think that's a Harmon," Gus said. "Harmon Development. They built the warehouse complex off the 58 2 years ago, bought half the undeveloped land between here and Victorville." He looked at her. "His father's name is Gerald Harmon." Emma said nothing. "Just telling you who you're dealing with," Gus said. "I'm fine," she said. She carried the tray back to the table. She was doing fine. She told herself this and kept telling herself this in the intervals between placing the drinks, checking her order pad, and making the return trip to the counter for a replacement, when the taller woman announced she had asked for no ice in a tone suggesting the ice had appeared there through some deliberate act of defiance. "I must have missed that," Emma said, reaching for the glass. "You didn't miss it," Bryce said. He leaned back with the ease of someone fully at home in a space that belonged to someone else. "She said no ice. That's a simple instruction." He looked at Emma with the measured attention of someone examining a thing they have already categorized. "People in your position go through the motions. No real attention, no investment. That's the difference between where you are and where," he gestured at himself, at the group, at the general concept they collectively represented, "anywhere else." From the counter, one of the regular men turned his coffee cup slowly in his hands. Clifford Allgate put down his pen. Gus reappeared at the pass-through window and was very still. In the corner booth, Walt Briggs placed both hands flat on the table in front of him. It was not a dramatic gesture. It was barely a gesture at all. But something in his face had changed in the way weather changes, not suddenly, but with a shift in pressure that everything in the room could feel before anything in the room could see it. Amaya replaced the drink. She wrote nothing on her pad. She said, "Ready to order, or do you need another few minutes?" And Bryce picked up the menu with the expression of a man inspecting something he expects to disappoint him. "Chicken fried steak," he said. "What's it like?" "It's made from scratch. Gus has been making it the same way since he opened." "Is it any good?" "It's the most ordered thing on the menu." He set the menu down. 5 of them. "Gravy on the side, not the plate. Tell whoever's cooking to make sure the oil is fresh." He looked at her. "And make sure the ice is clean," he said again. Not because it needed saying again, because saying it again was the point. She went back to the counter. She tore the ticket and set it in the window. Gus took it without a word. For the next several minutes, the diner held a kind of forced ordinary. The kitchen sounds filled the space. Bryce and his group talked among themselves. Their voices occupied the room the way certain kinds of the voices do, without asking, without noticing that the room had been occupied by other sounds before they arrived. Emma was at the window booth refilling coffee when she heard her name. Not her name exactly, not Emma, just Waitress. She turned. Bryce was holding up his glass, nearly empty. Ice melted condensation running down the side. He was not looking at her with impatience. He was looking at her with something more considered than impatience. The look of someone who is conducting an experiment and is about to introduce the second variable. She crossed to the booth with the soda gun. You know, Bryce said as she pressed the button, his voice carrying the specific warmth of someone who has decided to be generous with an observation. There's a version of your life where things went differently. Emma filled the glass. I'm not being cruel, he said. I mean that genuinely. You're young enough to still correct course. You could go back to school, get a skill, do something with your life that isn't. He looked around the diner with a slow survey, the scuffed floor, the faded boards, the ceiling fan, and its mediocre rotation. This. He said it with the tone of a man who believes the saying of it is itself a form of kindness. The generosity of someone who knows more giving that knowledge to someone who has less. Emma pulled the soda gun back. She looked at Bryce Harmon, not the customer service look, the other one. Thank you, she said. She turned. What happened next took approximately 2 seconds and had consequences that would take considerably longer to finish arriving. Bryce's right leg extended under the table. It was a casual movement, unhurried, the movement of someone adjusting their position, shifting weight, getting comfortable. The kind of movement that could have been accidental. The kind that was not. Emma's left foot caught the edge of his loafer. The physics were simple and complete. A tray with 4 full glasses. Forward momentum already in motion. The sudden removal of solid ground from beneath one foot. The body's instant and helpless recalculation. The tray tilted. For one fraction of a second, all 4 glasses were still themselves. Distinct objects, their contents contained belonging to their shapes. Dark liquid, ice, the last interval of before. Then gravity finished its calculation. 3 glasses left the tray in the same direction. Forward and down toward the booth, toward the white linen shirt, toward the gold chain, toward the face that had just finished explaining to Emma Ryder what a different version of her life might look like. The sound was significant. The silence after it was more so. Bryce Harmon stood. He stood slowly in the way a person stands when they are giving themselves time. Time for the shock to locate itself in the body. Time for that shock to travel upward and become something with a name. Dark soda ran from his chin onto the gold chain. It soaked through the white linen in spreading shapes. Ice had landed in his collar. His face was the color of a man whose blood pressure has done something sudden. He looked at Emma. You too, he started. She was already reaching for napkins. The reflex of someone who works in a diner and has been trained to approach every spill as a problem with a solution. She was reaching across to the next table, grabbing napkins, moving toward him. Bryce slapped her hand away. The napkins fell. Do you have any idea? His voice had found its level now. Not the quiet instructional voice he had been using. Something colder. A voice Emma recognized from a different time in her life, from a different man, from a chapter she had closed and locked and chose not to revisit. The voice of someone who has decided you owe them something you cannot pay. That shirt is worth more than your rent, he said. I tripped, sir. I'm so sorry. You tripped. He repeated it with a contempt that compressed the word into something smaller and more specific. That's always what it is. I tripped. I didn't mean to. I made a mistake. He leaned toward her close enough that she could smell expensive cologne mixing with the sweetness of the soda soaking into his clothes. I want the manager. I want you terminated. I want... He reached across the table. He picked up the one glass that had remained upright on the tray. Chad's drink, untouched, still full, still cold. He looked at Emma. Maybe, he said quietly, almost gently, you should see what it feels like. Before she could step back, before Gus could come through the kitchen door, before anyone in the room could cross the distance between where they sat and where she stood, Bryce Harmon threw the contents of the glass directly into Emma Ryder's face. The ice hit her cheek like something thrown with intention. The cold liquid drenched her hair. Her uniform ran into her eyes. She gasped. She stood blinded, one hand raised, dripping in the center of the dining room, and Bryce's group erupted behind him. Bullseye, one of them said. Bryce grabbed a dry napkin from the adjacent table and wiped his own hands with the focused attention of a man completing a task. He looked at Emma, who was standing with soda in her eyes and her hands at her sides, and he looked at the floor where the glasses had fallen. Get on your knees, he said, and clean that up, all of it, before I call my father and have this place shut down and your name on a list that keeps you from working in this county for the next 10 years. Emma stood in the middle of the dining room, the soda stinging her open eyes, and she felt something that she did not have a clean word for, something that was below anger and below shame and below everything else, a deep basement-level feeling that was about being a person in the world and being treated as if that were not the case. She had a son to feed. She had $420 to find by Friday. She had no safety net and no alternative, and no one in her corner. Slowly, because all of those things were true, Emma Ryder began to lower herself toward the floor. The diner was absolutely silent. No counter conversation. No kitchen sounds. The ceiling fan turned and the refrigerator hummed, and there was no other sound in the room except the soft weight of what was happening. And then there were boots on the linoleum, heavy boots, black engineer boots with a metal harness ring that caught the light as they crossed the floor. Not hurrying, not performing, moving with the unhurried deliberateness of someone who has decided where they are going and does not require anyone's cooperation to get there. The boots stopped beside Emma. She was half crouched, one hand near the floor. She looked up. The man from the corner booth was standing over her. Up close, he was a different proposition than he had been in the shadow of the corner. He was 6 feet 3 inches tall and built in the way that belongs to actual work rather than performed effort, the proportions of a man whose body had been required to be strong rather than appear strong. His shoulders were wide in the way of things that carry weight. His hands hanging at his sides were the hands of a man who had used them. His face was completely still. He extended one of those hands downward. It was the size of something that could wrap entirely around a baseball and have room left over. "Stand up," he said. His voice was low and level with the texture of something that had been worn smooth by decades of use. Not gentle, but not unkind. Emma hesitated. "Stand up," he said again, and this time there was something underneath the words, not softer but more specific, more directed. He did not wait. He reached down, took her arm with a care that was surprising in something that large, and brought her to her feet as if she weighed nothing. He looked at her face, at the soda in her hair, and on her collar, and running slowly down the line of her jaw. He reached into the back pocket of his jeans and brought out a blue bandana clean folded into a square. He held it out. "Wipe your eyes," he said. Emma took it. He turned. Bryce Harmon had stopped laughing. The laughter had ended at approximately the same moment the boots began crossing the floor, and now he was looking at the man standing between him and Emma with the expression of someone who has felt the temperature of a room change in a direction they did not anticipate. The man was looking at him. Just looking. Not moving toward him, not raising his voice, just looking at him with the patient, unhurried attention of someone who has a long memory and is currently consulting it. "Who are you?" Bryce said. He tried to make it sound like a statement of dismissal. It came out as something closer to a question. "Name's Walt," the man said. "Walt." Bryce said the name with the performative indifference of someone trying to establish that the name means nothing. "You made a mistake getting involved here, Walt. This is between me and her. She ruined my shirt in my afternoon, and I want the manager, and then I want her gone." "I saw what happened," Walt said. "She tripped." "I saw your foot," Walt said. A beat. The room compressed. Bryce's face did something small and quick. A recalibration. "You were in the back. You couldn't see anything from there." "I see everything from there," Walt said. "That's why I sit there." He took one step closer. One step was all it took. The air pressure in the room changed the way it changes when something large and patient makes a decision. He looked at Bryce, at the white shirt, the gold chain, the trembling stillness of the group in the booth, who had stopped being Bryce's audience and become witnesses to something they had not signed up for. "You tripped a working woman," Walt said. His voice was entirely level, the way a table is level, the way the floor is level, not because it is performing levelness, but because that is its nature. "Then you threw a drink in her face. Then you tried to put her on her knees." He paused. The pause was not theatrical. It simply gave those 3 facts room to stand in. "In my world, we have a name for men who do that. It isn't a name anybody wants." Bryce's survival instincts were present. They had just been outbid for 22 years by other instincts. He reached for the one resource that had always worked. "You have no idea who you are talking to," he said. He stood. He put his phone on the table. "My father is Gerald Harmon. He built half this county. He's built relationships in this town that go back 30 years. If you touch me, you will be arrested before the sun goes down, and every lawyer in his building will be working on making sure the rest of your life is a very long inconvenience." He looked at his friends for support. Only one of them managed anything. "Call the police, Blake." Walt did not move. He looked at Bryce the way a man looks at a word he has heard before in a different sentence. He looked at him for 2 full seconds. Gerald Harmon, Walt said. He said it the way you say a name when you are tasting it, when you are placing it in a context the other person in the room cannot see. The name arrived in Walt's chest before it arrived anywhere else, a cold stillness spreading through him that had nothing to do with fear. A specific focused stillness that people who have known Walt Briggs for a long time would have recognized as the opposite of standing down. He knew that name. He knew it from 1994. From a double-wide construction trailer on a site in San Bernardino County. From a handshake agreement made between a sweating project manager and the chapter and agreement for security and labor that had paid 40 cents on the dollar and had then been reclassified when the work was finished and the site was built and the legal department had been consulted as a verbal misunderstanding with no documentation of the terms. The people who had made the deal were the kind of people you could do that to, and Gerald Harmon had known it. Walt had let it go. That was the truth of it. Other matters. Wrong time. He had let it go, and Gerald Harmon had built his warehouses and his subdivisions, and 30 years had passed the way 30 years pass. Now Gerald Harmon's son was standing in front of him. Walt looked at the shape of the face, the color of the eyes, the specific inherited quality of the posture, the way he stood in a room as if the room already belonged to him, and everyone in it was a temporary arrangement. He felt Gus's eyes from the pass-through window. He turned his head slightly. Just enough. Gus was holding up his phone. On the screen was an image from the corner camera, a high-angle shot of the booth. The tray Emma's foot in the clear, unmistakable geometry of Bryce Harmon's leg extended beneath the table at the precise moment Emma's foot had caught it. 11 seconds of footage. One angle. No ambiguity. "Don't touch that," Walt said to Gus. Gus nodded once and lowered the phone. Walt turned back to Bryce. "The camera got your foot," Walt said. Bryce's eyes moved to the corner, to the small lens angled down at the booth, to the blinking red light that indicated it had been recording since the iron bell opened at 5:30 that morning and would continue recording until Gus turned it off at closing, as it did every day, as it had done every day for 4 years. Something moved through Bryce's face. Quick, contained, but real. He looked at Walt. He looked at the phone in his own hand. He dialed. Gerald Harmon answered on the second ring. "Bryce, I'm in the middle of something. Dad." The voice that had been projecting authority 30 seconds ago had lost altitude considerably. "I'm at a diner on 66. A waitress spilled drinks on me. There's a biker threatening me. He won't let us leave." "A biker?" "Yeah, big guy, leather vest. Has that skull thing on the back. Bottom patch says Purdue." A silence on the line, different from the silence of a busy man deciding whether to be interrupted. This was the silence of a man who has heard something that requires a different kind of attention. "What does he look like?" Gerald said. Bryce looked at Walt. "Gray beard, huge, has a patch on the front, says Hammer." The silence that followed was 5 seconds long. It was one of the most instructive silences Walt could have designed. Walt leaned forward slightly, bringing his voice closer to the phone in Bryce's hand. "Richie," he said. The word landed on the line like a stone dropped into still water. 6 seconds of silence this time, each one heavier than the last. When Gerald Harmon's voice returned, it was different. The boardroom quality was still there, but underneath it now, or beside it running parallel, was something else. A careful, measured something that took its time. A quality of voice that people who had spent their lives in rooms where power resided would have recognized immediately as the sound of someone who knows exactly where they stand. "Hammer," Gerald Harmon said. "Is that you?" "Yeah, Richie, it's me." A breath on the line. Audible, involuntary. "Your boy," Walt said, kicked a working woman off her feet, threw a drink in her face, told her to get on her knees, in front of a room full of people. He looked at the room, at Gus in the window, at Clifford Allgate with his pen set down and his hands flat on the table, at the 3 men at the counter stools, every one of them turned toward the booth. "I've got witnesses, and I've got it on camera, Richie. The foot and everything after." "Bryce," Gerald's voice came through the phone speaker hard and without preface. "Did you do that?" "She started it. She spilled." "I don't want to hear what she did." The boardroom voice had recovered itself, but it was pointed now, directed with precision. "Put Hammer on." Bryce looked at Walt. Walt looked at the phone. "Hammer." Gerald's voice had the quality of a man who is speaking to someone with whom he has a specific and serious history and who is not pretending otherwise. "What do you need from me?" Right now, I need your boy to apologize to the woman he just drenched. Out loud. In front of everyone here. And then I need him gone. A pause. Bryce. Gerald's voice dropped to something that was not louder, but was significantly colder. You are going to apologize. To the waitress. To everyone in that room. And then you are going to get in your car and you are going to drive directly to my office. Do you understand me? Dad, you don't know what. Do you understand? A long beat. Yes, Bryce said, barely audible. And Bryce. The voice from the phone had gone quiet in a way that was somehow more serious than the cold version. If Walt tells you to leave, you run. You hear me? You run. The call ended. The diner held the silence for several seconds. In it, the refrigerator hummed. The ceiling fan turned. The brass bell above the door was still. Bryce Harmon stood with his phone in one hand and the ruins of his morning in the other, and looked at Walt Briggs, who had not moved. The thing that was happening in Bryce's face was complicated. It was the face of a 22-year-old man encountering for the first time the specific geometry of a world in which his last name was not the largest object in the room. He had 22 years of evidence that his name ended conversations. He was looking at the counter evidence. He turned to Emma. She was standing beside the counter, the blue bandana in her hands, her uniform still damp, her eyes clear. She was watching him the way a person watches something that is not yet finished happening. I'm sorry, Bryce said. It was barely a word. It was the sound of a word stripped of every quality that makes an apology mean something, said from neither feeling nor understanding, said only from the pressure of what was happening around it. Louder, Walt said. Bryce said it louder. It was not a redemptive moment. It was not the kind of apology that comes from a person who has understood something. It was a consequence wearing the shape of a choice, and everyone in the room could feel the difference. But it was said out loud in a room full of witnesses with the name attached to it. Leave her something, Walt said. Bryce opened his wallet. His hands had developed a slight, fine tremor in the last 2 minutes. He put 3 20s on the table. He looked at them. He slid out of the booth. He walked to the door without a word to his friends, and his friends followed in the rearranged silence of a social hierarchy that had undergone rapid and involuntary restructuring. They did not knock anything over on the way out. They did not say anything. The door chimed behind them. Through the front window, the signal green Porsche started with a sound that was considerably more impressive than anything that had happened inside the diner. And then it was gone. The Iron Bell diner held the silence for 3 full seconds. Then Gus Merritt put both hands on the pass-through window ledge and clapped. It was not a restrained clap. It was the clap of a man who had cooked in this kitchen for 22 years and had developed a comprehensive skepticism about most aspects of human behavior, and who had today seen something that bypassed that skepticism entirely and produced in him a response he had not planned and did not try to contain. The 3 men at the counter stools joined him, uneven at first, finding rhythm. The man on the far stool, who had been driving long-haul routes for 30 years and had arrived at a general position of low expectations regarding how human beings treat each other, was slowly shaking his head with the expression of someone who has just witnessed something they will describe to people for the remainder of their natural life. Clifford Allgate thumped his table twice with the flat of his palm. Not applause exactly, a punctuation, an endorsement. Emma Ryder did not clap. She stood where she was, the blue bandana still in her hands, and she felt something move through her chest that she did not immediately have a word for. Not quite relief. The morning had happened. The things said had been said. The burning would continue to be present for some time. But adjacent to relief, the first full breath after a long interval without one. She looked at Walt. He had already turned. He was walking back toward his corner booth, moving between the tables with the unhurried ease of a man returning to where he had been rather than arriving somewhere new. He sat down. He put his hands around his coffee cup. The coffee had gone cold while he was standing. Emma crossed the floor. She picked up the cup. She brought it back fresh and hot and set it in front of him without a word. He looked up. Thank you, she said. His eyes held hers for a moment, the hard-to-read eyes that had been watching the door all morning. In them now was something older, more specific, something that cost something to hold. You've got 3 tables waiting, he said. She stood for a moment longer. Then she nodded and she went back to work. Walt wrapped both hands around the fresh coffee and looked at the door where Bryce Harmon had stood. He thought about what the camera had recorded and what it meant, and what a 22-year-old who had just been publicly handed his first real consequence by a man his father was afraid of was going to do with the next hour. Because Walt Briggs had been alive long enough and had known enough people like Bryce Harmon to understand that there were 2 kinds of people in a moment like this one. the kind who walked away and sat with what had happened, and the kind who got back in their car and made a phone call. Bryce Harmon was going to make a phone call. Walt could feel it the way he could feel a storm front moving in off the desert, not through the eyes, but through everything else, through the skin and the gut, and the decades-long practice of reading situations as they actually were rather than as they appeared. He could feel the machinery that was about to be set in motion. He could not yet see the specific shape of what it would do to Emma Ryder, but he could feel the general shape, and the general shape was not good. He looked at Emma moving between tables. At the customer service smile back in place, operating independently of whatever she was actually feeling, performing the ordinary competence of a person whose job required the performance. At the uniform still damp from the soda. At her hands on the order pad steady the way she kept them steady, with the specific discipline of someone who has decided that steadiness is the thing she can control when other things are not. He thought about a Tuesday 7 weeks ago, his first time in the Iron Bell. He had come in because it was on Route 66 and because the sign said coffee and because he had been driving in no particular direction and needed to stop. He had sat in the corner because that was where he sat. He had watched Emma work because his eyes did not stop working in a room. He had come back the following Tuesday and the one after. He was here today on a Monday because he had woken at 5 in the morning with Cassie on his mind in the particular way she appeared on some mornings, not as an absence, which was how she lived in most of his days, but as a presence specific and clear the way she had been when she was young, and the world had not yet done to her what it did. He had needed somewhere to put himself. He had driven to the Iron Bell. He looked at the camera in the corner. He looked at Gus in the window. He thought about Gerald Harmon's voice on the phone, the careful, measured quality of it, the fact that the name Hammer had produced, even after 30 years, that particular silence. Gerald Harmon was not a man who was afraid of things easily, which meant that what Walt represented was either something very specific or something very large. He thought it is probably both. He thought whatever Bryce is about to set in motion, Gerald Harmon knows the consequences of letting it run. He thought a man who knows the consequences and still lets it run is either unable to stop it or has decided it is worth the risk. Walt looked at Emma at table 4, writing an order, nodding at something the customer had said, the customer service smile doing its steady, tireless work. He thought she has no idea what the next 4 days are going to look like. He thought, but she is not going to face them without someone in her corner. He picked up his coffee. Outside Route 66 ran east and west through the flat August heat, the way it had run since before anyone in the Iron Bell diner had been born. The desert pressed in from every side. The Harmon development warehouses were visible on the horizon to the north, low and gray heat rising off their metal roofs in visible currents. They had been built on land, acquired through processes that had required certain relationships and certain silences and certain amounts of money flowing in certain directions. Walt knew about those processes. He knew them the way a man knows the specific mechanics of a machine that was once used on him. He set his cup down. He put his hand in his vest pocket. He took out a folded photograph worn at the creases. He had been carrying it for 3 years. He opened it. A young woman laughing at something off camera. Her hair the same color his had been before the gray came. She was holding a coffee cup in both hands, the way people hold things they find worth holding, and her whole face was open, unguarded, present in the moment in the complete way that people are present in moments that feel ordinary when they are happening and irreplaceable when they are gone. He looked at it for a long moment. He folded it and put it back. He reached into his vest. He took out a $5 bill. He set it on the table beside the coffee cup. Exact. As always, he did not get up yet. He stayed in his corner booth with his back to the wall and his eyes toward the door, and he drank his coffee in the particular way of a man who is not done yet, with a place who has something still to watch over, who has decided not dramatically, not with announcement, but with the quiet finality of someone who has made this kind of decision before, that he is not leaving until he is certain the morning is finished with her. The ceiling fan turned. The brass bell above the door was still. The morning held. The signal green Porsche made it 4 miles before Bryce Harmon stopped driving like a man who had just been told to leave and started driving like a man who had decided he hadn't actually lost. There is a particular kind of pride that cannot be injured without being converted. It cannot simply absorb a wound and carry the scar forward. It has to do something with what happened. It has to take the heat of humiliation and run it through some internal process and produce from it a plan, because a plan is the only thing that resembles control when control has been visibly removed. Bryce pulled onto a desert overlook on Mulholland Drive. The engine ticked as it cooled. The canyon spread out below him, dry and enormous and indifferent. He sat in the leather seat of his car, and he held the steering wheel with both hands, and he breathed through his nose in the steady way of a man trying to prevent himself from doing something immediate. He sat there for a while. Then he picked up his phone. He did not call his father. His father had already made clear which side of the line he was standing on, and that was information Bryce filed away in the part of himself that kept score on things like that. The part that would come back to it later, the part that did not forget. He scrolled through his contacts until he found the name he was looking for. Commissioner Dale Pruitt. Dale Pruitt was 57 years old and had been the city commissioner for building and development services in Barstow for 11 years. He was a compact man with a gray mustache and the measured affect of someone who had spent a long time performing competence in a public role. He drove a modest car. He attended the right community functions. He coached a youth baseball team on Sunday afternoons and was present enough at his church to be considered a member of standing. He was by most visible measures a civil servant doing his job. By certain other measures, he was a man with a gambling problem that had been active and escalating for 4 years and whose debts had been quietly serviced through a series of financial arrangements that could not accurately be called loans because they had never been intended to be repaid. They had been intended to purchase something else entirely. The going rate for a city commissioner's administrative flexibility, as it turned out, was not that different from the going rate for most things. "Commissioner," Bryce said when the line connected, "it's Bryce Harmon." A pause that contained several things at once: recognition, calculation, the particular wariness of a man who knows exactly what a phone call like this means and is going to receive it anyway. "Bryce, what can I do for you?" "I need a health inspection, the Iron Bell Diner on Route 66 today, within the hour if possible." Another pause. "That's short notice." "I know. The Iron Bell has been in operation for 50 years. They had an inspection not 4 months ago. They got a clean bill." "Things change," Bryce said. "Conditions deteriorate. That's why we have inspectors." The silence on the line had a specific quality. It was the silence of a man doing arithmetic. "The hardest one you have," Bryce said. "I want the full treatment." "And the employee, Sarah, Emma Ryder." Bryce looked out at the canyon. The sun was fully up now, hammering the desert floor white. "I want her situation examined as well. Housing, any outstanding issues with her lease, any code violations at her address." "That's a different department." "You know people in every department, Dale. That's why our arrangement works." One more pause, longer than the others. The pause of a man measuring the distance between what he is about to do and who he has always told himself he is. "Give me 90 minutes, Pruitt said. Bryce hung up. He looked at the canyon for another minute. Then he started the car. The 90 minutes felt different to different people in Barstow that morning. To Bryce Harmon driving back toward the city, they were the productive minutes of someone who has set something in motion and is now waiting for the motion to complete. To Emma Ryder, they were minutes of ordinary work. Table 4 needed clearing. The coffee at the counter needed refreshing. The lunch prep list that Gus had written on the whiteboard needed checking off. She moved through the minutes with the focused efficiency of someone who does not have the luxury of processing what has happened until later, when the work is done, and maybe not even then. She thought about the morning once briefly while she was restocking the napkin dispensers. She thought about the sound of the glasses hitting the floor, about the cold of the soda on her face and in her eyes, about the specific weight of kneeling the moment when her legs had begun to bend before the boots appeared beside her. She put the napkin dispenser down and she picked up the next one. Walt was still in his corner booth. He had not left. He had ordered a third cup of coffee, and he had read the newspaper that someone had left on the adjacent table, and he had done both of these things in a way that looked like the ordinary behavior of a man who had nowhere to be, which was not at all what it actually was. He was watching the door. He was watching Emma. He was watching the camera in the corner, whose red recording light blinked with the steady patience of something that had recorded everything and retained it and would continue to do so. At 10:47, the white city van pulled into the gravel lot. Emma saw it through the window before she heard the door. There is a specific shape that certain kinds of official vehicles have when they arrive somewhere you do not expect them, a shape that is recognizable before any detail resolves, before you can read the lettering on the side or see the uniform of the person getting out. It is a shape that her body identified before her mind did a cold drop in the stomach that preceded understanding. The man who came through the door had the bearing of someone who had done this particular job for a long time, and had developed through that repetition a complete separation between what he was doing and what it meant. He was carrying a clipboard and a flashlight. He had a lanyard with an ID card. His uniform was pressed. "Health department," he said. "Surprise inspection. I need the kitchen shut down immediately." Gus appeared at the pass-through window. He had a spatula in one hand and the expression of a man who has been working the same kitchen for 22 years and has earned a particular right to be skeptical. "We had our inspection in April," Gus said. "We got an A, comes right off the printer. There's been an anonymous complaint, possible vermin activity and improper refrigeration." The inspector was already moving toward the kitchen, not waiting for permission, the momentum of his clipboard and his lanyard and his official purpose carrying him through the space. "I need to see the walk-in. I need to see behind the appliances. I need the grills off. You can't just walk in here and—" "I can, sir. Under California Health and Safety Code Section 114397, authorized inspectors have the right of entry at any time during operating hours." He said this in the tone of someone who has recited it many times, the words worn smooth from repetition. "Please shut down the grills." Emma watched from the counter. Walt watched from the corner. The inspector moved through the kitchen with the systematic attention of someone who knew what they were looking for. Not in the sense of finding what was actually wrong, but in the sense that a man who has been told what result to produce understands which surfaces to point his flashlight at and which drawer to open and what to write on his clipboard, regardless of what the flashlight illuminates. It took 22 minutes. When he came back through the kitchen door, he was writing something on the form attached to his clipboard. He wrote with the concentration of someone composing a document rather than recording an observation. "I'm finding rodent evidence behind the main freezer unit," he said without looking up. "That's impossible," Gus said. "Walk-in refrigerator is operating at 42 degrees. Code requires 40 or below. The thermometer reads 39. I check it every morning. There's also a fractured tile adjacent to the main sink that constitutes a structural hazard under Section 114257. He finished writing. He tore the bottom copy from the form and held it out to Gus. "I'm issuing a suspension notice. You're shut down pending full remediation and reinspection. Minimum 72 hours. Gus looked at the paper. He looked at it in the way a man looks at something he understands to be real, but cannot yet reconcile with his knowledge of how the world is supposed to work. "Today is Monday," Gus said. 72 hours is Thursday morning. That's the whole week. Take it up with the department." The inspector was already moving toward the door. His clipboard was under his arm. The transaction, as far as he was concerned, was complete. Gus said, "We live week to week here, son. You know that, real people, week to week." The inspector did not stop. The door chimed behind him. The red grate he had attached to the front window was visible from inside, bright as a wound. Gus stood in the kitchen doorway with the paper in his hand. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he looked at Emma. "I can't pay you if we're closed," he said. The words came out with difficulty, not because he didn't know how to say them, but because saying them required confirming that they were true. "You understand that?" "I understand," Emma said. "This isn't your fault." She looked at the red grate on the window. "It feels like it is," she said. Walt Briggs was already on his feet. Emma clocked out. There was nothing else to do. The kitchen was cold, the grills were off, the lunch prep list on the whiteboard was irrelevant. She got into her car and drove home. The word home was already doing something strange in her head as she drove, as if she could feel it losing accuracy in real time, like a word that becomes unfamiliar when you repeat it too many times. Home. 4 days until Friday, $83 in the account. This week's tips evaporated. She pulled onto her street and she saw it before she fully processed it. Corbett Tully's car was in the driveway. Beside him, a sheriff's department vehicle, white with the county seal on the door. Emma sat in her car for a moment. The engine ran. The air conditioning moved the stale air around. She watched the two vehicles through the windshield with a feeling she could not immediately name something that occupied the space between panic and a terrible kind of recognition. The recognition of a thing you feared was coming and can now see has arrived. She turned off the engine. She walked to the porch. Corbett Tully was a man of 71 who had owned this duplex for 19 years and managed it with the careful, slightly apologetic approach of someone who needs the rental income, but is personally uncomfortable with the power dynamic of being a landlord. He had given Emma 2 extensions on late rent over the past year. He had fixed the kitchen faucet himself rather than hire someone. He was in the taxonomy of landlords a decent one. He was not looking at her. He was looking at his shoes. The specific posture of a man who knows that what he is part of is wrong and has decided to be part of it anyway, and cannot look at the person he is wronging while that decision is being executed. The deputy was a man of about 40 in a pressed uniform. He had a professional neutrality that was not unkindness, but was not warmth either. He was doing a job. Ms. Ryder, yes. I have a writ of immediate possession. He held out the document. The property has been sold effective this morning. The new owner is exercising an immediate vacancy clause based on documented hazardous conditions. Emma took the papers. She looked at them. The letters arranged themselves into words, and the words arranged themselves into meaning, and the meaning arrived all at once whole, the way bad news arrives when there is no good version of it to hope for first. Hazardous conditions, black mold in the walls, structure deemed unsafe for occupancy. She looked at Tully. He was still looking at his shoes. Mr. Tully, she said. Her voice was level. She was making it level. What is this? He made a sound, not quite a word. The property has been sold to Apex Holdings, LLC, the deputy said. I understand this is disruptive. You have 1 hour to collect your essential belongings. The structure is being secured for remediation. 1 hour, Emma said. I have a 3-year-old. I understand. The 1 hour window is from this point. She looked back at the papers. Apex Holdings, LLC, a name she didn't know. A company that existed she already understood for the specific purpose of being between the person who gave the order and the order that was given. She looked at Corbett Tully. She said his name. He raised his eyes. In them was the look of a man who has made a decision for reasons that are real to him and cannot be undone, and who will carry the weight of it forward in ways he has not yet fully accounted for. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. He brought out a photograph. Old, the color faded towards sepia at the edges. He held it out. 2 men, standing outside a building under construction. One of them was Tully, 30 years younger, in a hard hat. The other was a man Emma had not seen in a photograph since she was 14 years old. Her father, Danny Ryder. I knew him, Tully said. His voice had the sound of something that had been compressed for a long time and was now releasing at a pressure it couldn't contain. We worked together for a summer, 2001, before the accident. Emma looked at the photograph. The accident, she said. Tully looked at the photograph in her hands. He looked at the younger version of himself. Your father did the right thing. He was the only one who testified. The foreman told everyone to stay quiet. Gerald Harmon's lawyers were already in the room before the ambulance left the site. He paused. Your father told the truth anyway. He lost his job, Emma said, 3 months after his testimony. The company found a reason. They always find a reason. Tully looked at his shoes again. He never worked in construction again. I know that. He got sick 4 years later, Emma said. He couldn't afford the treatment. Tully said nothing. He died when I was 16, Emma said. The silence on the porch was the kind of silence that holds specific weight. They came to me last week, Tully said. Someone from Apex Holdings, cash offer. Double the market value. They said the unit needed to be empty today. They knew your name, Emma. They knew you lived here. This was not a coincidence. He finally looked at her directly. The full weight of what he was part of, visible in his face unmasked. I have medical bills. I have my own situation. I told myself it wasn't personal. Emma looked at her father's face in the 20-year-old photograph. She handed it back. 1 hour, she said to the deputy. She went inside. Noah was at the neighbor's house. Mrs. Gable, who was 74 and watched daytime television with the focused dedication of a professional and who had been Noah's unofficial second grandmother for 2 years. Emma knocked on Mrs. Gable's door and collected her son. Noah came out with both arms up, the standard greeting of a 3-year-old who has not yet learned that arms up is something you grow out of. She picked him up. She held him against her for a moment longer than the moment required. He smelled like the lavender soap Mrs. Gable kept by her kitchen sink. Mama tired? He asked. Mama's fine, she said. She had 47 minutes. She moved through the apartment with the systematic focus of someone who has thought about emergencies at an abstract level and is now executing the plan she made in those abstract moments. Clothes for Noah first, then her own. Then the documents, birth certificates, social security cards. The folder in the bottom desk drawer that contained everything irreplaceable. The small amount of cash from the kitchen drawer. Noah's elephant. Noah's blanket. The photograph of her father that she kept on the windowsill in the bedroom, the one where he was laughing at something off camera, and his whole face was open and young and unguarded. She did not take everything. There wasn't time and there wasn't space. She took what mattered and she put it in garbage bags because she did not have suitcases, and she carried it to the car in 3 trips, while Noah sat on the front step holding his elephant and watching her with the alert, careful attention of a child who does not know what is happening, but understands that what is happening is significant. On the last trip, she stopped in the doorway of the apartment. She looked at the rooms where she had lived for 2 years. The kitchen with the fixed faucet. The bedroom with the window that let in the morning light at an angle that she had liked. The living room with the second-hand couch and the small television, and the crayon marks on the lower portion of the wall where Noah had decorated it one afternoon before she could find the crayons and put them somewhere higher. She did not let herself look too long. She pulled the door shut behind her. The deputy secured the padlock. Corbett Tully had already gotten in his car and driven away. Emma strapped Noah into his car seat. She got in the driver's seat. She put the key in the ignition. Click. She tried again. Click, click, click. The starter motor. She had known it was going. She had known it for 3 weeks, had budgeted the repair into a theoretical future where there was money available for. It had told herself it would hold, had needed it to hold. It had not held. She sat in the driver's seat of a car that would not start in front of an apartment that was no longer hers, with $43 less in her account than she'd had when the morning began, and 4 days until a deadline that she was now almost certain she could not meet, regardless of what the next 4 days contained. Noah said, "Car sleeping." Something like that, Emma said. She put her head against the steering wheel. She did not cry immediately. She held it for a moment, the way you hold something heavy when you first realize you're going to have to put it down, wanting to delay the moment of putting it down because putting it down is the confirmation that you cannot carry it anymore. Then she put it down. She cried. She cried with the particular quality of someone who cries rarely, and who, when she does, cries with the accumulated pressure of everything that has been held back, everything that has been redirected, everything that has been labeled manageable until it isn't. She cried for the apartment and for the morning and for the grilled cheese she hadn't eaten and for $420 and for her father's face in Corbett Tully's photograph young and laughing, not yet knowing what was coming. Noah reached forward from his car seat and put one small hand on the back of her neck. He didn't say anything. He was 3 years old, and he had his mother's instinct for when words were wrong and when the only thing that was right was being present and touching the person you loved with whatever part of you could reach. She felt his hand. She breathed. She heard it before she saw it. The vibration came through the pavement first, through the frame of the car, through the seat beneath her. A low, syncopated thrum that built without hurrying, that had a rhythm like something biological rather than mechanical, like something alive. She raised her head from the steering wheel. In the rearview mirror, 3 motorcycles were turning onto the street. They were not racing. They were moving in the unhurried, deliberate way of people who know where they are going and know they will get there and are not in a hurry about it, because a hurry would imply that the situation controlled them rather than the other way around. They moved in a formation that suggested long practice, the spacing between them fixed and precise, the kind of formation that communicated coordination to anyone who was paying attention. The lead bike was a Harley-Davidson Road King Black with chrome that caught the August light. The rider wore a gray thermal under his vest, the same patches. Walt Briggs pulled alongside her window. He killed the engine. He kicked the stand down. He leaned forward on the handlebars and looked at her through the window with the expression of a man who has already assessed the situation and has moved directly to what needs to happen next. She rolled down the window. Her eyes were still wet. She didn't try to pretend they weren't. She had used up her reserves for pretending somewhere between the padlock and the starter motor. "Car won't start," she said, "and I don't live here anymore." Walt looked at the padlock on the apartment door. He looked at the tire tracks from the deputy's vehicle still visible in the dry dirt of the driveway. He looked at the garbage bags in the back seat and Noah in his car seat holding his elephant. "Bryce," he said. It was not a question. "Someone bought the building," she said. "Apex Holdings. They said black mold. The diner got shut down by the health inspector an hour after you left." She heard her own voice saying it, and it still sounded even to her like the summary of something that had happened to someone else. "I have nowhere to go, Walt. I don't know what to do." Walt looked at the apartment door for a moment. His jaw worked in the slow, deliberate way of someone grinding something down before they speak. He turned to the younger rider on the bike behind him. The man had a red beard and a scar that curved through his left eyebrow in a way that suggested the story behind it was interesting, and he moved with a careful, contained energy that suggested he was younger than he looked and more reliable than he appeared. "Crow," Walt said. "The car." Crow was off his bike before the word finished. He had the hood up on the Corolla in less time than most people would have taken to find the hood release. He leaned in. He looked. He straightened up. "Starter's fried," he said. "I can bypass it, but it won't hold." "Get it running," Walt said. "She follows us." He looked back at Emma. "Pack anything that didn't make it into the bags," he said. Emma looked at him. She was at this particular moment in the position that people reach sometimes in their lives, the position where two very different paths present themselves, and neither one is simple. And both of them require trust in something that cannot be fully verified. The street with a dead car and no money and nowhere to go. Or the man in front of her. She had known Walt Briggs for 6 weeks of Tuesday mornings. She knew his order and his tip and the way he nodded when she refilled his coffee, and the way he had stood up in the diner that morning, and the way he had said her name to a phone, and the way his voice had sounded when he said it. She thought about the boots beside her when she had been half kneeling. "Stand up, darling." "Where are we going?" she asked. "Somewhere safe," he said. Then looking at Noah, his voice dropped a register softer than she had heard it. "Hey." Noah looked at him over the back of the seat with the open, evaluating attention of a child who has not yet learned to perform disinterest. "Are you a pirate?" Noah asked. Something moved through Walt's face, quick and unmistakable there and then contained. Not quite a smile. Something older than a smile. "Something like that," he said. Noah considered this with great seriousness. "Do you have a ship?" "I have something better," Walt said. Crow had the engine running. It turned over rough and unhappy, but it turned over. He wiped his hands on his jeans and looked at Emma. "Don't turn it off once you're moving. Keep it running until we get there." Emma nodded. Walt mounted his bike. The Road King came to life with a sound that was not subtle and was not trying to be. "Stay between us," Walt said. "Nobody touches you." She pulled out behind him. The compound was 10 miles from Barstow proper in the flat industrial zone where the desert reasserted itself against the edges of the city. It was not dramatic from the outside. High chain link fencing, topped with razor wire. Security cameras at regular intervals. A steel gate that operated electrically and had the look of something that had been reinforced beyond its original specifications. As the gate rolled back, Emma saw the rows of motorcycles parked in precise lines, the way she imagined military vehicles were parked, not in the careless way of personal vehicles left, wherever convenient, but in the ordered way of things that belong to people who take their property seriously. There was a main building low and long with the converted warehouse bones of something that had been something else before it was this. There were several outbuildings. Walt led her to the one at the back of the property. He unlocked the door. He stood aside. Emma walked in with Noah on her hip and stopped. It was not what she had imagined. She had not fully articulated what she had imagined, but she had imagined something, and this was not it. The room was small and clean. There was a kitchenette with a 2-burner stove and a full-size refrigerator, a table with 2 chairs, a couch that had been there for a long time but had been maintained, a television. In the bedroom, a bed with a wooden frame and on it a quilt that was handmade, the kind of deliberate, careful work that takes time and means something. Emma put Noah down. He walked immediately to the couch and patted it, assessing its viability, and then climbed onto it with the confidence of a child who has not yet encountered a piece of furniture he couldn't conquer. "My wife made the quilt," Walt said from the doorway. He was looking at it the way people look at things that mean more than their object. "She made 3 of them. I kept them all." A pause. "She passed 2 years ago." Emma looked at the quilt. The colors were blues and greens, the kind of colors that suggested deliberate choices, someone who had thought about what they wanted and made it. "I'm sorry," she said. Walt came in. He sat in one of the chairs at the table, the one facing the door. His hands rested on his thighs. He looked at the floor for a moment. "Tell me about your father," he said. She looked at him. "Tully told me a little," he said. "On the phone on my way here. He called me. I think he needed to tell somebody." His eyes came up. "Tell me the rest." Emma sat on the edge of the bed. Noah had found the television remote and was examining it with the focused interest of a scientist approaching new equipment. She told him. Danny Ryder had been a construction foreman with 20 years in the trade, the kind of man who knew every joint and every load bearings calculation and every code by heart, who had built things that were still standing because he had done them right the first time. In the summer of 2002, working on a Harmon development warehouse outside Barstow, there was an accident. A scaffolding collapse that injured 2 workers, one seriously. The cause, documented in Danny Ryder's own notes and confirmed by 2 independent assessments, was a cost-cutting substitution in the scaffolding hardware that the site foreman had been told to make by the project manager. Gerald Harmon's project manager. The company's lawyers arrived before the investigation was formally opened. The site foreman was given a narrative and a number. The other workers were given a number. Danny Ryder was given both. He refused them. He testified in the civil proceeding brought by the injured workers. He told the truth under oath in a way that cost him everything. It cost him, which became clear over the following months. His foreman position was eliminated. His references went unreturned. In an industry built on word of mouth and professional networks, silence from the right people is as effective as a blacklist. He found work on smaller jobs. Day labor. He did not complain about it. He was not a man who complained. He got sick in 2006. Lung disease, the kind that belongs to a life of construction sites and materials that nobody told you were going to do what they were going to do to your lungs. The kind that takes years to show up and then shows up all at once. He did not have health insurance because the jobs he had been able to find for 4 years did not come with health insurance. He died in 2008. Emma was 16. She told it without performance. Just the sequence of it, the way it had actually happened, the way facts lay, when you've carried them long enough that they've lost their sharp edges and become part of the geography of who you are. When she finished, Walt was looking at the quilt again. I knew who Gerald Harmon was before his son said the name, Walt said. He paused. In 1994, we did work for his company. Security, labor, things that needed doing when the site was in a part of the county where the regular contractors didn't like to work after dark. He looked at his hands. When the job was done, the agreement changed. The company's lawyers sent a letter. The arrangement had been verbal, they said. There was no documentation of the terms. The matter was considered closed. Emma looked at him. We didn't pursue it, Walt said. That's the truth of it. The chapter had other things going on. It wasn't the right time. And then time passed the way time does, and Gerald Harmon built his warehouses and his subdivisions, and we moved on. He was quiet for a moment. I've thought about that decision many times over the years. Why did you come in today? Emma asked. You come on Tuesdays. Walt looked at her for a long moment. He reached up and pulled his thermal shirt to the left, exposing the portion of his chest above his heart. On it was a faded tattoo, the lines thickened and blurred with age. A name in simple block letters. Cassie. Below it a date, 2021. My daughter's name was Cassie, Walt said. She was 26 years old. She tended bar at a place in Reno. He looked at the name on his chest, then back at Emma. A man decided she owed him something. She didn't. She told him so. He decided that what she thought didn't matter. Walt's hands were still on his thighs, but the stillness of them had changed, become something controlled, rather than natural. I was inside at the time. I had made a decision years earlier that caught up with me, and I was paying for it. By the time I was out, the man who hurt my daughter was already free. His family had resources, the kind of resources that convert problems into administrative matters. Emma said nothing. Cassie never came back to herself after, Walt said. Not all the way. There was a version of her that I remembered and that she couldn't get back to, and I think after a while she stopped trying. A long pause. She took her own life in 2021. March. Emma looked at her hands. I come on Mondays now, sometimes, Walt said. It used to come on Tuesdays because Cassie worked Tuesday lunch shifts here when she was at school. I come when I need to. He looked at Noah, who had given up on the remote and was now lying face up on the couch looking at the ceiling with the total relaxation of a child who has decided the current situation is acceptable. When I saw your boy, I thought about her at that age, before everything, when she was just herself and the world hadn't taken anything yet. The room held the particular quiet of two people who have told each other something true. Emma reached over and touched the edge of the handmade quilt. What do we do now? She asked. Walt stood. Now he said, I go have a conversation with someone. You stay here. The gate is locked. Crow is on the property. He looked at Noah. There's food in the refrigerator. I stocked it this morning. Emma looked at him. You knew, she said. I suspected, he said. There's a difference. I hoped I was wrong. He walked to the door. Walt, she said. He stopped. The diner will reopen, he said before she could ask. The inspector who came this morning, his name is Vickers. He has a problem with card games that he's been losing for 2 years. We know the man who runs the game. He said this not with satisfaction, but with the matter-of-fact quality of someone describing the workings of a familiar mechanism. The Iron Bell will be open by Wednesday. He left. She heard his boots on the gravel outside. She heard the Road King come to life. She heard it move away through the compound. She looked at Noah on the couch. Hungry? She asked. Hungry, he confirmed with the conviction of a man who has thought about it. She went to the refrigerator. The conversation Walt had that afternoon was brief and did not go in the direction Walt expected. He drove to Harmon Tower, a 14-story building in the newer commercial district of Barstow that bore Gerald Harmon's name on its face in steel letters that caught the afternoon light. He parked the Road King in the visitor spaces. He walked through the lobby without his vest, clean black shirt, dark jeans. He moved through the chrome and glass interior the way a weathered board moves through polished water. Gerald Harmon was on the 12th floor. The receptionist had apparently been briefed. She made no calls and asked no questions. She said Mr. Harmon was expecting him and pointed him toward the corner office, and in the small telling geography of that interaction, Walt understood that Gerald Harmon had been expecting this visit since the phone call that morning. Gerald was standing at the window when Walt came in. The view from the 12th floor was as good as a view of Barstow could be, the flat grid of the city, the desert pressing in from every side, the mountains in the distance blue and indifferent. He was 62 years old, silver-haired, dressed in the careful way of a man who has decided that his appearance is part of his authority. He looked like a man holding something up. He turned when Walt entered. He looked at him with the expression of a man who has been conducting his own calculations and has arrived at a number he finds unpleasant. Hammer, he said. Richie, Walt said. He crossed to the desk. He put down the phone he had borrowed from Crow, playing a recording at low volume just loud enough. The voice of a man named Lenny coming through the small speaker, admitting to payment, admitting to the compound, admitting to the name of the person who had given the instructions and what those instructions had been. Gerald listened. He looked at the desk. He looked at the window. When it ended, he said, "How much?" Walt pulled out a folded piece of paper. He set it on the desk. Gerald read it. The list was short. The Iron Bell Diner reopened the suspension, rescinded Commissioner Pruitt removed from his position. The deed to Emma Ryder's building transferred to her name. A trust fund for her son. The legal protections that would make all of it real and not merely verbal. Gerald took his gold pen from his inside pocket. He read through the list a second time. He picked up the phone on his desk and made a call that lasted 40 seconds, instructing someone on the other end to begin the legal transfer process for Apex Holdings' most recent acquisition. He made a second call of similar length. He signed the paper Walt had brought. He dated it. He pushed it back across the desk. Walt looked at the signature. He folded the paper. He put it in his shirt pocket. "The footage stays with me," Walt said. "Insurance. Lenny goes down for trespassing. The rest stays quiet." Gerald nodded. He was looking at the city through the window again. "Bryce is coming here at 3 o'clock, Gerald said. "He thinks he's getting good news." Walt said nothing. "I'll handle my son," Gerald said. Walt looked at the man at the window, a man who had built an empire by knowing which agreements to honor and which to reclassify. A man who had spent 30 years converting inconvenient truths into administrative matters. A man whose signature was, as of approximately 3 minutes ago, attached to a document that made specific and binding promises. He looked at the signature on the paper in his pocket. He walked to the door. He was almost through it when his phone rang. He stopped. Crow's name on the screen. He answered. Crow's voice came through flat and direct, with the quality of someone who has news and is not wasting time delivering it. "Boss, Gerald Harmon's legal team filed 2 motions in the last 20 minutes. Unlawful detention extortion. They're claiming we held Lenny against his will and coerced a confession. They're also claiming the conversation you just had constitutes criminal extortion." A pause. "There's a search warrant application for the compound. Dale Pruitt signed the request before he was removed. Someone pushed it through before the removal took effect." Walt looked at the paper in his hand. He looked at Gerald Harmon's signature. He looked at Gerald Harmon, who was standing at the window with his hands behind his back, looking at the city he had built. Walt turned around. He walked back to the desk. He unfolded the paper. He looked at the signature. He looked at it carefully. Below the signature line, where a notary seal would be required for a property transfer of this kind, there was a space. The space was empty. The seal was not there. The signature was ink on paper. Without the notary seal, the property transfer was not legally binding. The trust fund authorization, similarly structured, had the same absence. Gerald Harmon had signed with a pen that cost $300 and the full authority of a man who had spent 40 years knowing exactly which lines mattered and which did not. He had signed the lines that did not matter. He had not signed the ones that did. Walt stood at the desk. He looked at Gerald Harmon at the window. Gerald did not turn. 30 years ago, Walt said, "You sent a letter. You said the agreement was verbal. You said there was no documentation of the terms. Gerald said nothing. I let it go, Walt said. That was a mistake. He folded the paper again. He put it back in his pocket. His face was still. His voice was still. He was a man who had learned the difference between anger that consumes and anger that focuses, and he was operating from the second kind. Your lawyers have 48 hours, Walt said. After that, the footage goes to every news organization in the county. Lenny talks to whoever wants to listen, and I find another way. He walked out. The elevator descended. The lobby passed. The Road King was where he had left it, in the visitor parking in the August sun, its chrome throwing light in every direction. Walt sat on the bike. He did not start it immediately. He sat and looked at the building with Gerald Harmon's name on it in steel letters, and he understood with the complete clarity of a man who has stopped being surprised by things that the morning's victory in the Iron Bell had not been a beginning and an end. It had only been a beginning. The machinery he was up against had been built over 4 decades by a man who knew how to use it. It had absorbed more serious challenges than a biker with a phone recording. It had attorneys on retainer in civic relationships and the specific knowledge of which documents needed which seals. Walt thought about Emma in the compound apartment. He thought about Noah on the couch with his elephant. He thought about the camera footage in Gus Merritt's diner. The footage that showed with the clear-eyed honesty of an angle and a lens exactly what kind of man Bryce Harmon was and exactly what he had done. He thought about the fact that he did not have to be the only person who knew about it. He started the Road King. He had 48 hours, and Emma Ryder he was beginning to understand was not the kind of woman who sat in a safe room and waited for someone else to solve her problems. He had not fully understood that yet. He would before this was over. He pulled out of the parking lot. Behind him through the glass of the 12th floor, Gerald Harmon stood at the window and watched him go. Part 3. What remains? Walt rode back toward the compound with the August sun directly in his eyes. He did not put on sunglasses. He let the light hit him the way it was hitting him, flat and white, and without mercy the way the Kuwaiti sun had hit him in 1991 when he was 24 years old and the world had seemed like a place with clear coordinates, clear enemies, clear purposes. He had learned since then that clarity was usually temporary and should not be mistaken for truth. But he had also learned that temporary clarity used correctly in the window it occupied could accomplish things that no amount of long-term planning could replicate. He had 48 hours. He thought about Gerald Harmon at the window, the careful practiced stillness of a man who has survived this kind of confrontation before, who has learned that the first wave of any assault can be absorbed if you have the right structure underneath you. Gerald had the structure. He had built it over 40 years, and he knew every load-bearing point in it, and he had lawyers who knew the same things he did. What Gerald did not have, Walt thought, was the footage. The footage was the thing. The 11 seconds of camera angle from the corner of the Iron Bell diner that showed without ambiguity, without the possibility of competing interpretation, exactly what Bryce Harmon had done with his right foot and exactly what had followed from it. You could argue about everything else. You could recharacterize verbal agreements and reclassify the findings of inspectors and file motions about the legal status of confessions obtained under circumstances that your lawyers would describe one way and Walt would describe another. You could do all of that. Lawyers existed specifically to do all of that. You could not do it to 11 seconds of clear video. He turned off the highway toward the compound. The gate opened before he reached it. Crow had been watching the cameras. The compound was quieter in the late afternoon than it had been in the morning. 3 members who had been present earlier were out. The 2 who remained were in the garage working on a Sportster that had developed a sound it wasn't supposed to make. The sound of the work metal on metal, a wrench finding its purchase, was the sound of the compound at rest. Walt parked the Road King. He sat on it for a moment before getting off the way he sometimes did, using the stillness to think. He got off the bike. He walked to the rear building. He knocked twice before opening the door, which was a thing he did not do by habit, but had decided to do here because this was not his space. He had made a rule of that in his own mind from the first day. Emma was not on the couch. She was not in the kitchenette. She was at the table, sitting across from 2 people Walt had never seen before. One of them was a woman of about 40 with short dark hair and the kind of watchful positioned attention of someone who takes notes for a living and is currently not taking notes because she is listening too carefully to take notes. She had a phone on the table in front of her, its small red recording light on. She was from the Desert Sun. Her name was Patricia Okafor, and she had been the paper's investigative reporter for 11 years, and she had the face of someone who had heard many things and had learned to measure them against each other before deciding what they meant. The other was a man of about 50 in a jacket that was slightly too warm for the weather, carrying the specific distraction of someone whose mind is always working one level deeper than the conversation on the surface. He was a civil rights attorney from San Bernardino. His name was Douglas Meade, and on the table in front of him was an open manila folder with documents inside it that Walt could see from the doorway were not nothing. Emma looked up when Walt came in. Noah was asleep on the bed in the other room. Walt could see him through the open door face down in the way of small children who sleep as though they have been switched off one arm, draped over the gray elephant. Emma looked at Walt with an expression that was specific and composed and did not apologize for what he was seeing. "I called them yesterday," she said, "before you came back from Harmon Tower." Walt looked at the reporter, at the lawyer, at the folder on the table. He looked at Emma. "Patricia has been tracking Harmon development for 3 years," Emma said. "She was already building a file. I gave her what I had, the story about Della Marsh, the documentation I found in the courthouse public records, about the 4 settlements, the material about my father." She paused. "Douglas is handling the civil case." Walt pulled out the remaining chair and sat down. "What documentation?" he said. "Bryce Harmon has been named in 7 civil complaints in 4 years." Douglas Meade said, opening the folder. 4 resulted in settlements. Non-disclosure agreements, sealed terms, all standard. 1 was withdrawn before filing. 2 are currently active. He turned the top document so Walt could see it. "The pattern is consistent. In each case, the plaintiff was a woman in a service or hospitality role. In each case, the complaint followed a refusal of some kind. In each case, the settlement included a clause about cooperation with Gerald Harmon's legal team on other matters." "And they bought the silence," Walt said. "They bought everything available for purchase," Meade said, "which in cases involving working-class plaintiffs without financial resources for extended litigation is usually quite a lot." Patricia Okafor said, "Della Marsh is in Victorville. She's agreed to go on record." Walt looked at Emma. He looked at the woman across the table from him, 24 years old, who had been kicked to the floor that morning and evicted from her home that afternoon, and who had somewhere in the hours between those 2 events made a series of phone calls and arranged for 2 professionals to drive to a motorcycle compound outside Barstow with a manila folder and a recording device. He had come to this building expecting to find someone who needed to be told what was happening next. He sat for a moment with the recalibration that this required. "The footage," Walt said to Patricia Okafor. "I'd like it," she said without drama, "but I don't need it. What I have already is sufficient for the story." "What's the story?" She looked at him with the direct assessment of someone deciding how much to explain. "Gerald Harmon has been using civil liability as a management tool for his son for 4 years. He's been using his relationships with city officials to suppress complaints, including code enforcement and health inspection processes, when those complaints intersected with his properties or interests." She paused. "That's the story I can print with what I have. The footage strengthens it. It doesn't create it." Walt looked at the folder. He looked at Emma. He said, "There's a search warrant application for this property. Gerald's lawyers filed motions this afternoon claiming extortion and unlawful detention." Douglas Meade said, "I know, I've already filed a response." The warrant application was procedurally deficient. It was signed by Commissioner Pruitt, who was removed from his position this afternoon, which creates a chain of authority problem. It won't hold. He said it with the flat confidence of someone describing a structural fact. "But that's not the bigger issue right now." "What's the bigger issue?" "Gerald Harmon's attorneys have contacted the 2 remaining active civil complainants and made new settlement offers in the last 2 hours." Meade said, "If those women accept, it narrows the evidentiary foundation considerably. We have a window." Walt looked at the table, at the folder, at the recording light on Patricia Okafor's phone. He looked at Emma. She was watching him with the expression of someone who has made a decision and is waiting to see whether the person across from her is going to respect it or override it. There was something in the expression that was not defiant exactly, but was adjacent to it. The expression of someone who has spent a long time being acted upon and has decided to act. "What do you need from me?" Walt said. Emma said, "The footage." Walt nodded once. He took out his phone. He sent a text to Gus Merritt with 3 words. "Send it now." The reply came back in 40 seconds. A link. He turned the phone to Patricia Okafor. She watched it. She watched it a second time. She set the phone down and looked at Emma. "I'll have it online by morning," she said. What happened next happened the way things happen when a structure that has been under private pressure for a long time is suddenly subjected to public pressure at the same point. Not gradually, not with warning, the way a wall goes. Patricia Okafor's story went live on the Desert Sun website at 6:47 the following morning. It was not a short story. It was the kind of story that takes 3 years of a reporter's patience and one night of extraordinary focus to finish, the kind that arrives with documentation attached with named sources, with court records cited with an 11-second video embedded in the third paragraph that showed clearly and without any need for editorial commentary a 22-year-old man in a white linen shirt deliberately extend his foot beneath a table and hook the ankle of a woman carrying a tray. The Associated Press picked it up at 9:15. By noon, it had been shared 40,000 times. Harmon Development Holdings' publicly traded subsidiary lost 22% of its stock value before the market closed. Gerald Harmon's office released a statement at 2 in the afternoon. The statement used the phrases deeply concerned, full cooperation, and does not reflect our values in combinations that suggested it had been written by someone who had written statements like it before and had a template. The statement did not help. Commissioner Dale Pruitt submitted his resignation at 3:17. He sent it by email with no additional comment to the city manager's office. The email was 3 sentences long. The FBI field office in San Bernardino contacted Gerald Harmon's attorneys about 4:40 requesting documentation related to the financial relationship between Harmon Development and Pruitt's office over the preceding 11 years. Lenny Spike formally charged that afternoon with criminal trespassing and possession of incendiary devices, declined the public defender assigned to him, and declined to comment on anything. He sat in a holding cell and he thought about things. He thought about the nature of his current situation and about who had put him in it and about the fact that the person who had put him in it was currently experiencing his own difficulties and might not be in a position to be as useful going forward as he had been before. Lenny Spike was not a wise man in most respects, but he was a man who had survived by accurately assessing which way the wind was blowing before it changed direction. He asked to speak to the deputy. Bryce Harmon did not go to his father's office at 3 o'clock as he had been instructed. He had gone 2 days earlier, and the meeting had not produced the outcome he expected. His father had been at his desk when he arrived, and the desk had had nothing on it except a series of documents and a gold pen, and Gerald Harmon had looked at his son with an expression that Bryce had seen his father use on other people, but had never in 22 years seen directed at him. The expression of a man who has decided that a problem he has been managing has become a problem he is no longer willing to manage. Gerald had laid it out with the precision of someone who had thought through the sequence in advance and was not interested in improvisation. The financial accounts, the trust fund, the Porsche which was technically held through a company that was technically in Gerald's name, the condo and the new development on Prescott Street, the credit facilities, all of it. Bryce had said things, he had said a number of things, and some of them had been angry, and some of them had been the kind of things that people say when they are discovering in real time that what they understood to be the permanent architecture of their lives was in fact a series of decisions that someone else had been making and could unmake. Gerald had listened to all of it. He had waited until it was done. Then he had pressed the button on his desk and said what he had to say. Bryce had been walked out by 2 security guards who had the professional courtesy to use his arms and not his collar. He landed on the pavement of the parking structure on the ground floor of Harmon Tower in a suit that had cost $400 and in a pair of shoes that had cost considerably more, and with $20 in his wallet because the cash he usually carried was in the jacket he had left in the car that was no longer his. He had stood there in the parking structure for a while. He had walked to a bus stop. He had ridden the bus to the apartment that was no longer his and had stood outside it in the afternoon heat, looking at the door that his keycard no longer opened. He had sat on a bench across the street, and he had looked at his phone, which still worked because it was on a personal plan he paid himself, except that the credit card it was billed to had been canceled, which meant the bill would not be paid next month, which meant the phone would not work next month. He had thought about calling people. He had scrolled through his contacts with the systematic attention of a man auditing his assets, and he had understood with the progressive clarity of someone who has always moved at the center of a social gravity that had nothing to do with him personally, that the people in his contacts were not his friends. They were the friends of his last name and his credit card and his signal green Porsche. He scrolled through them, and he could already hear in advance the specific quality of the pauses that would follow his description of his current situation. He had not called anyone. He had eaten a sandwich from a gas station. He had spent 3 nights in a shelter that smelled of industrial disinfectant and other people's accumulated defeats. He had gotten a job at a fast food restaurant on the second day, not because he knew how to get a fast food job, but because his body had carried him through the door and his mouth had said the words before his mind had finished deciding whether to. The uniform was a synthetic fabric in a color that had no name worth giving it. The shift started at 6 in the morning. He was very bad at it initially. He got better, not because he chose to, because the job required specific things and that one was all he had. And the alternative to getting better at it was getting worse at it, and getting worse at it produced consequences that were no longer theoretical. He learned that the oil in the fryers needed to be at a specific temperature or the food cooked wrong. He learned that the coffee needed to be restocked before it ran out, not after because the line didn't pause for restocking. He learned that the people who came through at 6 in the morning were people who were getting to work and that work was real for them in the specific way it was real when the absence of it was not an inconvenience but a catastrophe. He learned these things in the way people learn things when there is no softer version of the lesson available. He was 7 days out from the parking structure when he woke at 5 in the morning in his shelter bunk and lay in the half-dark and thought about a grilled cheese sandwich on the counter of the Iron Bell Diner and the woman who worked there and what she had done with a year's worth of bad options and a 3-year-old son in a car that wouldn't start. He lay there for a while. Then he got up. The Iron Bell Diner had reopened on Wednesday morning. The inspector named Vickers had arrived Tuesday afternoon to conduct what he described as a compliance verification following the resolution of the previously reported concerns. He had moved through the kitchen with the systematic attention of a man who is looking very hard for something he has been told not to find. He had checked the walk-in refrigerator. He had examined the floor behind the freezer. He had looked at the tile near the sink. He had written a clean bill. The red grade came off the window Tuesday evening. Gus Merritt had taken it down himself, standing on the step stool he kept by the counter, peeling the adhesive backing away from the glass, with the focused care of someone removing something offensive from something that deserved better. He had held the red card for a moment. He had looked at it. Then he had thrown it in the dumpster behind the kitchen and gone back inside and turned the grill on. Wednesday morning, the Iron Bell opened at 5:30. The regulars arrived in their usual sequence. The truckers. Clifford Allgate at his table. The 3 men at the counter stools who had nowhere to be and were in no hurry about it. Emma came in at 5:15 to prep the tables. Gus had already been there an hour. When Emma walked through the door, he looked at her from the pass-through window with the expression of a man who has thought about what he wants to say and has decided that what he wants to say is complicated, and so instead he said, "Coffee's on." She poured herself a cup. She stood at the counter and drank half of it. She looked at the clean window where the red card had been. She set down the cup and started on the tables. Walt came in on Wednesday, not at his usual time. He came in at mid-morning after the breakfast rush when the diner had settled into the quieter rhythms of late morning. He sat in the corner booth. Emma brought him coffee and toast without being asked. He looked at her. She looked at him. "It held," he said. "I know," she said. "Patricia called me this morning." He nodded. "Douglas says the property transfer goes through the proper channels by Friday." He said, "The notary issue is resolved. Gerald decided the path of resistance was more expensive than the path of compliance." Walt looked at his coffee. He's a practical man ultimately. "And the trust fund, same timeline." He paused. 75,000 education restricted. Emma sat down across from him. It was the first time she had sat at his table. She set her order pad on the surface in front of her and folded her hands on top of it in the way of someone settling in for a specific conversation. "I want to tell you something," she said. He waited. "When I called Patricia, she said, I wasn't doing it because I thought it was the smart move. I wasn't doing it because I had a plan." She looked at her hands. "I did it because I thought about Della Marsh sitting in a shelter in Victorville. And I thought about my dad. And I thought about the next woman who comes along and doesn't have a," she paused, choosing the word, "a Walt, who sits alone in a diner because no one stood up for her." She looked at him. "I couldn't not do it, that's all." Walt said nothing for a moment. "Cassie," he said finally. He said just the name, and it contained everything he needed it to contain. Emma nodded. "You couldn't save her," she said. "Not unkindly, just factually in the way that true things can be said when the person you're saying them to has already spent years knowing them." "No," he said. "This didn't save her either," Emma said. "I want to be clear about that. I know it's not the same thing." Walt looked at her for a long moment. "No," he said, "it's not the same thing." He picked up his coffee. "But it's not nothing." The morning light came through the front window of the Iron Bell Diner at a low angle, and landed on the floor in a long rectangle of gold, the kind of light that is particular to a certain time of year and a certain time of day, and that exists for only a few minutes before the sun moves and it changes into something ordinary. They sat in it for a moment without speaking. Then Emma picked up her order pad and stood up and went back to work. On the day that Bryce Harmon walked through the door of the Iron Bell Diner for the second time in his life, the weather had shifted. The brutal peak of the Barstow summer had begun its slow retreat, and the mornings had acquired a quality that was not yet cool, but was no longer the assault that August had been. The desert light was different in September. Still hard, still uncompromising, but with something underneath the hardness that was closer to honest than brutal. He came in at 7:43 on a Tuesday. He did not look like the person who had come in 3.5 weeks earlier. The linen shirt was gone, the gold chain was gone. The sunglasses he had not bothered to remove indoors were not present because there were no sunglasses. He was wearing a dark shirt with a logo on the breast pocket that belonged to a fast food restaurant, the synthetic fabric slightly rumpled from what had clearly been a shift that ended not long before. His hair was not styled. His face was the face of someone who had been sleeping in conditions that were not conducive to rest. He looked smaller, not in any physical sense, but in the sense that the space around him had changed. The signal green Porsche was not outside. There was no group of people arranged around him to reflect his own importance back at himself. There was no performance being mounted and no audience for it. He was just a person walking through a door. He did not see Emma immediately. He looked at the counter stools. He looked at the menu board above the pass-through window, the hand-lettered prices, the daily specials written in Gus's block print. He looked at it in the way people look at things they need not, for entertainment, not for assessment, but because hunger is a teacher that does not allow for abstraction. Emma saw him from table 4. She watched him for a moment. She watched the shape of him, the particular defeated angle of his shoulders, the specific quality of his stillness, a person who has arrived somewhere and is not sure of their reception and is preparing already to absorb a version of what he has probably been absorbing for the past 3 weeks. She had thought about this. She had thought about it more than once in the quiet hours after Noah was asleep, in the particular silence of the compound apartment that she was no longer in. She had moved back to her building on Monday, the deed signed and notarized and legally hers, the black mold report officially retracted by the city's own assessor, who had found nothing behind the walls except decades of ordinary wear. She had sat in her own kitchen, and she had thought about what she would do if Bryce Harmon came back. She had not landed on a single answer. She had landed on several, and she had turned them over the way you turn stones, looking at what was underneath each one. She crossed the floor. Bryce saw her when she was 6 feet away. He saw her, and he did what people sometimes do when they are seen by someone who has earned the right to look at them directly, and without pretense, he started to move away from the direction he had been moving, not fleeing. More like the instinctive repositioning of someone who feels that the ground beneath them has just confirmed it is not solid. "We're not hiring," Emma said. He stopped. His shoulders dropped further. "I heard you might need someone," he said. His voice was different, not performing, not projecting, just a voice carrying words from one place to another. "The place down on Central let me go last Friday. He stopped. He looked at the floor, then back at her, and in the looking back there was something that cost him something. "I'm not asking for anything except the chance to, We're not hiring," Emma said again. His face did something. It did not collapse. It did something more controlled than that, the expression of someone who has been absorbing disappointments with enough regularity that the mechanism for absorbing them has become practiced, and who is practicing it now. He nodded. He turned toward the door. "But," Emma said. He stopped. She looked at him for a long moment. She looked at the synthetic fabric of the fast food uniform and the unbrushed hair and the specific quality of his face, which was the face of someone who is very tired and very hungry and has recently been educated in a way that is ongoing and not yet complete. She looked at him and she thought about her father. Not because Bryce was like her father. He was not. He was the opposite of her father in most of the ways that mattered. But she thought about what her father had believed stated out loud on more than one occasion in the kitchen of the house they had lived in when she was a child, and the world had seemed navigable about the difference between people and the actions they take, and whether those two things are permanently the same. "Sit at the counter," she said. Bryce looked at her. "I'm not offering you a job," she said. "I'm offering you a grilled cheese sandwich. You look like you haven't eaten anything real in a week." He stood there. "Sit down, Bryce," she said. He walked to the counter. He sat on the middle stool, the same stool where one of the three regular men sat most mornings, and he put both hands flat on the counter and looked at the surface of it. Emma went to the pass-through window. She wrote the order on her pad, tore it off, set it in the window. Gus appeared. He looked at the order. He looked at the back of Bryce Harmon's head at the counter. He looked at Emma. Emma did not say anything. Gus took the ticket. Emma brought a glass of water and set it in front of Bryce without ceremony. He picked it up and drank half of it with the urgency of someone who has not been thinking about hydration. From the corner booth, Walt Briggs watched. He had been there since 6:30. He came on Tuesdays now, without exception. He had his coffee and his dry toast in his corner booth and his back to the wall and his eyes toward the door, and he had watched Bryce Harmon come through that door in the particular way he watched everything completely, without urgency, without telegraphing. He watched Bryce at the counter. He watched Emma move to table 3 and table 6 and back to the counter and through the ordinary landscape of a morning at the Iron Bell. He watched the way she moved lighter than she had moved 3.5 weeks ago. Not lighter in the sense of not carrying weight, but lighter in the sense of the weight being distributed differently, carried in a way that was chosen rather than simply imposed. Gus slid the plate through the window. Grilled cheese. 2 halves golden on both sides pressed to the ideal density, the cheese melted through and not oozing, the bread not burned. A small pile of potato chips on the side because Gus made decisions about what a plate needed and acted on them without consultation. Emma picked up the plate. She set it in front of Bryce. He looked at it. Why? He said. Not a demand, not a challenge, a genuine, confused, unperformed question. Emma stood behind the counter. She leaned against the far edge of it, her order pad in her hand, and she looked at him with the directness of someone who has decided that the full truth is the only thing worth saying. My father lost everything because of your family, she said. He lost his career. He lost his health. He lost the years he should have had. She said it without heat. The facts laid flat. He never blamed anyone out loud. That was how he was. But I knew. I always knew. She paused. I spent 16 years being angry about it. Not all the time, but enough. The kind of angry that lives underneath everything else, and you don't always know it's there until it comes up in the wrong place. Bryce was looking at the plate. I could have let that be the whole story, Emma said. His family ruined my father's life, and his son came into my diner and tried to ruin mine, and the anger was there available with 20 years of supply behind it. She looked at him. But my dad used to say something. He said he didn't want to be the version of himself that bad things made him. He said that was the only thing nobody could actually take away from you, who you decided to be after. Bryce said nothing. His eyes were wet. Not the theatrical wetness of the social performance he had been running for 22 years. The real kind. The kind that comes when the thing that is happening in a person's chest has been happening long enough that the body insists on being part of it. I'm not forgiving your father, Emma said. I want to be clear about that. What he did to my dad, what he spent years doing to other people that has consequences, those are happening. That's not mine to let go of. Bryce nodded, a small movement. But you, she said, you're 22 years old. You've had the worst possible version of everything handed to you and told it was the best version. That's not an excuse. You're old enough to know the difference between right and wrong, and you chose wrong repeatedly, and people were hurt by it. She put the order pad down on the counter. But you're still 22, and what you decide to do with what you know now, what you've been learning the hard way for the last 3 weeks, that's yours. That belongs to you. She looked at the grilled cheese on the plate. Eat your food, she said. Bryce picked up half the sandwich. He ate it. He ate the way hungry people eat when they have been given permission to be hungry. Not quickly. Not with the performed casualness of someone pretending not to care, but with the real attention of someone for whom food has recently resumed its basic meaning. Nobody talked to him. Nobody made a production of his presence. Clifford Allgate at his usual table looked at his tea. The 2 men at the other stools drank their coffee. The ceiling fan turned. At the pass-through window, Gus Merritt watched Bryce eat. He watched him finish the first half and start the second. He watched him take the chips one at a time, a thing you do when you're making something last. Gus turned back to his grill. He was not a sentimental man generally. He had cooked in this kitchen for 22 years, and he had formed opinions about most aspects of human behavior, and those opinions were on the whole not generous. But he was a man who believed in the direct relationship between feeding people and what food meant, which was that it was the most basic act of saying to another person that they were worth sustaining. He had believed that since he was a young man and it had not changed. He cracked 2 eggs onto the grill. They weren't for any ticket. He was just cooking. In the corner booth, Walt Briggs finished his coffee. He sat for a moment with the empty cup. He looked at the room, at Emma moving between tables with her order pad and her real smile, which she was wearing, which she wore for the people who had earned it, which she had expanded over the past 3 weeks to include a slightly wider category of people than it had before. At Gus in the window, at Clifford Allgate doing a crossword puzzle, at the 2 men at the counter, at Bryce Harmon eating the last chip from the side of his plate with the particular focus of someone who is tasting something for what it actually is. He looked at the camera in the corner, the small red light blinking its patient record. He thought about 48 years of mornings. The ones in the Gulf in the flat, terrible heat of a country that was not his doing things he had been told were necessary and had decided were necessary and carried forward in a specific chamber of himself that he did not open often. The ones in prison which had their own texture and their own time, the particular quality of days when the shape of the day is given to you rather than chosen. The ones after building something in the desert with people who operated by a code that was not the code of law, but was not without principle. The Tuesday mornings here, for years, sitting in the corner, drinking black coffee, tipping $5, thinking about Cassie and the Tuesday lunch shift and a version of her that still existed here, embedded in the particular smell of the diner and the sound of the brass bell and the way the morning light came through the window. He thought about what Emma had said, who you decided to be after. He reached into the pocket of his vest. He took out a folded piece of paper, worn at the creases from being folded and unfolded. He opened it. It was a photograph printed on regular paper, the color slightly off because it had been printed on the compound's inkjet printer by someone who knew what they were doing, but not with professional equipment. Patricia Okafor had sent it to him. It was a photograph from Cassie's social media page, one he had not seen from the year before she died. She was laughing at something off camera. Her hair was the same color his had been before the gray. She was holding a coffee cup in both hands, and she was laughing, and her whole face was open and unguarded, the way faces are when the person behind them has momentarily stopped monitoring the presentation of themselves to the world and is just there present in a moment that felt ordinary at the time and turned out to be something worth keeping. He looked at it for a long time. Then he folded it and put it back in his pocket. He reached into his vest and took out a $5 bill. He set it on the table beside the empty coffee cup. Exact, as always. He stood up. He put on his jacket. He adjusted the vest. He looked at the room one more time, the full room, all of it, the whole modest geography of a diner that had been here since 1971, and would probably be here after everyone in it was gone because some things are built for permanence rather than ambition, and those things tend to outlast the things built for ambition. Emma looked up from table 3. Their eyes met across the room. He nodded. She nodded back. He walked to the door. He pushed it open. The brass bell chimed thin, cheerful, the same sound it had made 10,000 times before, the same sound it would make 10,000 times after. He stepped out into the September morning. The heat was still there, but it had pulled back slightly, the way heat does when the season has decided in its gradual and private way to begin letting go. The Road King was parked in its usual spot in the gravel, catching the morning light across its chrome. He stood beside it for a moment. He thought about Cassie. He thought about her the way he had been learning slowly and imperfectly to think about her not as the absence that had to be carried forward as a weight, but as the person she had been fully and specifically before the weight existed. The woman who had worked Tuesday lunch shifts in a diner on Route 66 and laughed at something off camera and held a coffee cup in both hands like it was something worth holding. He thought about Emma, about Noah asleep on the couch with his elephant, about the deed to a building signed in ink that had been properly notarized, about a trust fund with a child's name on it. He thought about what it meant to be able to do something this time. He got on the bike. He started it. The Road King came to life with its particular sound, deep and certain, the sound of an engine that had been well maintained by someone who understood that the things worth having were the things worth taking care of. He pulled out of the lot onto Route 66. He did not look back. Not because there was nothing worth looking back at, but because he was for the first time in 3 years not driving away from something. He was driving towards something, though he could not yet see the shape of it clearly. He knew it was there. He could feel it, the way you feel a road when you know it well enough that the directions are in your hands rather than your head. The desert stretched out on either side of him, flat and vast and lit in the particular way of September mornings, when the light is still hard, but has acquired something the summer light did not have. Something like patience. Something like the light that comes after the worst of the heat has passed that says the season has turned and something new is beginning in the quiet way that new things begin when they are real rather than performed. Walt Briggs wrote into it. Behind him in the Iron Bell diner, a 24-year-old woman moved between tables with her order pad. A 3-year-old boy ate scrambled eggs at the counter on Tuesday mornings now, when his mother's shift started early because Gus had quietly produced a booster seat from the back room and placed it on the counter stool closest to the window without being asked. A man who had come in every weekday for 11 years and ordered soft-boiled eggs and wheat toast was on his second cup of tea and had begun over the past 2 weeks to take slightly longer at his table than he used to, because the atmosphere of the place had shifted in some way he could not have articulated precisely, but that he had registered as people register things that matter in his body before his mind. On the front window of the Iron Bell diner, where a red grade had once been, there was now a gold letter A. Clean and simple, the morning light passing through it and landing on the checkerboard floor inside, in a shape that looked, if you were standing at the right angle, like something that meant something. Whether it did or didn't, the ceiling fan turned. The coffee was hot, and the brass bell above the door, which had been ringing since 1971, rang again.